Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, and tonight I'm joined again by Clement and tonight we're going to discuss, among other things, the biblical the view of monarchy, centralized governments, and centralized power. On the alternative right, we see a couple of strands, right? We see with the reactionary Catholics and Orthodox the desire for a kind of absolute monarchy. And then we see with the more atheist, materialist side, a desire for a sort of absolute state, kind of like based on the Third Reich. And both of them argue that it's part of the European heritage, and of course, in the case of the Trad Cats, part of the Christian heritage, to support these kinds of centralized systems. But I'd argue that both on the European and biblical tradition, that it's not actually European at all. I mean, Europe itself is based on essentially consensual government. The Greek city-states, the Roman Republic, the Celts and the Germanic tribes and the Russian tribes had, popular assemblies, the Vecha, the Volkmut, the Thing, where the men of the community would gather together to make judgments. The kind of all-powerful god king of like Egypt or Babylon was an importation. Alexander the Great, when he conquered Persia, adopted many of the trappings of Persians, and his own generals disliked it because they're like, that's not what we do over here. And then later on, the Romans, when they conquered the Greeks, who had already been infected by this, especially under Diocletian, adopted proskynesis and all these offensive attitudes, and brought that to Europe. And of course, Europe had this sort of centralized monarchy under the Roman Empire. And through the Middle Ages in the Holy Roman Empire, and in the East with Russia and Byzantium. But that was never what Europe was naturally. Its natural state was, limited governments, whether republics like in Rome or democracies in Greece or tribal democracies of the Germanic and Celtic tribes. And of course, in Christianity, we see a condemnation of monarchy most clearly in the Bible in 1 Samuel 8. Where Samuel condemns the Israelites for asking for a king like all the other nations. And we see it in Judges, where Abimelech, king of Shechem, murders his brothers, and he's judged for that. The one brother he fails to kill escapes and gives the wonderful parable of the trees. And, of course, then at that point, he then leads an insurrection against Abimelech, and Abimelech, in fact, his own men turn against him because God stirs them against Abimelech. And he's killed in a siege by a woman dropping a tile on his head. But I think it's pretty clear in both the biblical and European traditions, this kind of centralized autocratic control is abnormal.
Yeah, I think you hit on several points that we should get into in more detail as the conversation progresses, but I would certainly agree with you. Another term I've used rather than consensual government is deliberative government, which I think explains quite well how the traditional European form of government worked.
Yeah.
So, hey, can you hear me? Sorry to mention on
sorry,
you.
Yeah,
okay.
Fine.
Did I drop off or something, or I'm not sure.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. I'll just continue then. Yeah. So I think deliberative government's a good way to describe it as well. And I'd also mention that while it is true on the alt-right, you have people who are monarchists, people who are fascists or national socialists, but you also have people who kind of claim to be both, or claim that traditional European feudalism or monarchy basically is the same thing as National Socialism, and it most certainly is not. And Hitler actually made several very strong points about that in Mein Kampf and elsewhere, that their goal was a classless society, or a society based on nationalism, not dynastic patriotism, which frequently worked against the interests of the folk, or the people from which the king was drawn. So another area of discrepancy on the alt-right that needs to be addressed. So yeah, I don't know where you want to start. Maybe look at the biblical passages more closely, and see how monarchy, or especially Oriental monarchy or Caesarism, is really closely linked to idolatry.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, again, I think I'm looking it up now. Abimelech, the king of Shechem, he was a usurper. He murdered his brothers, and that was very displeasing to God. And he had one of his brothers escaped. What was his name? Let's see. Do you remember the name of the one brother that escaped to the 70?
Not off the top of my head, but maybe even if we go farther back, at first we can talk about Deuteronomy 17. Which is certainly something that the pro-monarchy side will frequently bring up, because indeed in Deuteronomy 17, it talks about, and this is from the King James version that I'm reading, starting at verse 14, it says, "When thou art come unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose, one from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee." So they'll point to this and say, well, look, even in the Old Testament law, it says that Israel will have a king, and therefore it's good. But if you look at the language there carefully, it just says that the Israelites will want a king. But then when you go to 1 Samuel, it's very unambiguous that the Israelite desire for a king was something that God disapproved of. And what I find so fascinating with Deuteronomy 17 is that it goes on to say that the king should not multiply wives to himself, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And if we look at even the relatively good kings in Old Testament history, like David or Solomon, David, the man after God's own heart, and Solomon, who was blessed in an unprecedented way with God's wisdom, they were really horrible kings by this standard set forth in Deuteronomy 17. So I think that in addition to the very clear statements in 1 Samuel condemning the Israelite desire for a king, it also teaches us throughout the Old Testament history how unreliable kings are, and that you can't just say that kings inherently love their own people or inherently virtuous or will govern in a wise manner. I mean, even Solomon, who had God's wisdom as a gift, turned away and multiplied wives and fell into idolatry, and was of course known for his wealth as well. So even the men who were most gifted by God with eminent wisdom and virtue, they still can't really be good kings by the biblical standard.
Exactly. I found what I was looking for. It's Judges 9, and the brother is Jotham. And Jotham gives the parable of the trees, which this will be again in the King James. "And when they told it to Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gerizim, and lifted up his voice, and cried, and said unto them, Hearken unto me, ye men of Shechem, and God may hearken unto you. The trees went forth at a time to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, Reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, Should I leave my fatness, wherewith by thy honor God and man, and go be promoted over the trees? And they said to the fig tree, Come thou and reign over us. But the fig tree said unto them, Shall forsake my sweetness and my good fruit, and give to be promoted to the trees. Then said the trees unto the vine, Come thou and reign over us. And the vine said unto them, Shall I leave my wine, which cheereth God and man, and go to be promoted over the trees? Then all the trees turned to the bramble, Come thou and reign over us. And the bramble said unto the trees, If ye anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow, and if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now therefore, if ye have done truly and sincerely, and that ye have made Abimelech king, and if ye have dealt with Jerubbabel and his house, and have done according to the deserving of his hands, for my father fought for you, and adventured his life far, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. And ye are risen up against my father's house this day, and have slain his sons, 70 persons, upon one stone, and have made Abimelech the son of his maidservant king over the men of Shechem. If you have dealt truly and sincerely with Jerubbabel and with this house this day, then rejoice ye in Abimelech, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out of Abimelech, and devour the men of Shechem, and the men of Milo. And let fire come from the men of Shechem, and from the house of Milo, and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and dwelt there for the fear of Abimelech his brother. So we see right here a very classic example where with the parable of the trees, we see the sort of anti-monarchical tendencies in the early Jews. Because again, God was to be their ruler. As God said to Samuel, they have not rejected you, they have rejected me as king over them. And I'm going to read, I think it's in beginning in here, 1 Samuel 8:10. I want to read 1 Samuel because it's so important. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked him for king, and he said, there will be the manner of the king shall reign over you. He shall take your sons and appoint them for himself for his chariots and to be his horsemen. He shall run before the chariots, and he will appoint to him captains over thousands, captains over fifties, and set them to ear his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest men and your asses and put them to work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. I mean, again, and everything Samuel prophesied came true. You know, we have the Naboth's vineyard where King Ahab murders Nabal to steal his property. We have Rehoboam.
The split up of the two kingdoms, of course, was due to the king being overbearing and wanting to exploit his subjects.
Well, exactly. I was going to bring up Rehoboam and the fact that he said his finger would be thicker than his father's loins. You know, and of course the 10 tribes of the north, the Ephraimites, said that we're done with this. And again, we see with especially the northern tribes of Israel, idolatry and monarchy go hand in hand. The only king of Israel that was quasi-good was Jehu, because he extirpated the house of Ahab. But even Jehu failed to end the sacrifices in Samaria.
Right, and if we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, I don't think you read this through verse 20, where the people respond to Samuel and say, nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And of course, they had the judges that God raised up in Israel, and also the Lord was with them in their battles, but they wanted a man that they could see, someone they could trust in a carnal fashion, not wanting to trust in the strength of God.
Exactly. And of course, like the king like all the other nations, what do they mean? They mean Egypt. They mean Egypt. They mean Moab. They mean Assyria. And these kings were seen as gods by their people and were treated them as slaves. I mean, the people of the ancient Near East were essentially serfs and slaves of the god kings that ruled over them. They had very few rights, very few liberties and freedoms, and life was fairly brutal for those people.
But they were very, at the same time, they were very attached to the cult of the king, and they had a sincere belief that the king was necessary as a mediator between man and God. And of course, in Christ, our king, our true king, he is our mediator, and the only mediator that we need. We don't need another king aside from him. But the function of the king, the office of the king in the Near East, was very closely tied to the pagan religious cult. Yes.
And of course, in the Old Testament, we had a strict separation between the religious cult and the king. So when the king Uzziah offered sacrifices, I think 2 Chronicles, he was punished with leprosy for violating the boundaries between the priest and the king.
That's right, yes. In most Near Eastern cultures, the king was the high priest as well. I mean, there are certainly priestly castes in addition to the royalty in some cases, but by and large, the king fulfilled a priestly function.
Yeah, like in Rome, the emperor was Pontifex Maximus as well.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned Alexander and his interaction with the Persians, and of course, you also had Julius Caesar's interaction with the Ptolemies in Egypt. where the Ptolemies, of course, they were originally part of Alexander's Greek Macedonian conquest of Egypt, but they really adopted a lot of the traditional pharaonic practices, and in a lot of ways were sort of the last pharaohs of Egypt. And when Julius Caesar became involved with Cleopatra and the Ptolemies in general, a lot of that was brought back to Rome, where, as you mentioned, going back to the earliest Greek writers, the real distinction between Europe and Asia had been the political systems, that people in Europe, that is Greece or elsewhere, but primarily Greece, were free, and the same in ancient Rome too, where they had abolished their monarchy centuries before and established the republic, but then sort of slid back into a very, I would say, degenerate form of monarchy with Caesarism, which was based, as I mentioned, more on the Egyptian pharaoh or other Near Eastern monarchs.
Exactly. I mean, for the Greeks, to be Greek was to be a member of the polis. It was a cultural, political identity, which is why also Alexander believed he could make the Persians Greek, but in the end, they made him Persian, not the other way around. And the Romans, with Diocletian, finally completed this transformation, begun with Alexander the Great. In fact, William Graham Sumner, the libertarian author, in the 1890s wrote a book called The Spanish Conquest of America, where he argued that the American imperialist war of aggression of the Spanish-American War was a victory of the old world imperialism that he believed America had been founded to repudiate. And in many ways, Diocletian was the Persian conquest of Rome, where the Romans, of all the European people, the most allergic to a king, Rex was a hated title in the Republic, and Caesar was killed for claiming to be Rex. And yet, paradoxically, much like America, they then ended up embracing the very thing they hated in its most degenerate form.
Right, and it's ironic that the term emperor or Caesar is actually even more monarchical or more autocratic than king, when of course originally that was not the case. As you mentioned, the Latin term for king, rex, was something that the Caesars could not claim for themselves, even though for all practical purposes they were kings. They would use the title Caesar or imperator, which just means more or less commander or something like that. But because they became so autocratic and such a centralized form of government, Caesar and emperor became basically another word for king, even though they were originally supposed to be sort of a workaround, a way for them to avoid claiming to be kings in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And if we look further north to the Celtic tribes and the Germanic tribes, while not as organized as Greece or Rome, they still practice what we might call a tribal democracy, where the men, the war chiefs, if you will, would have popular assemblies and elect the war chiefs, the leaders that would rule over them. Tacitus describes it in his Germania, where they would elect their own leaders from amongst their own ranks.
That's right, yeah. And maybe it's important also to point out, some people might say, well, Sparta had a monarchy, or they had kings. So I think we should address that real briefly, because that would be the one example in Greece in more historical times where you did have someone with the title king. But the kings in Sparta, first of all, there were two of them at the same time, and they would mainly function as military commanders. But their ability to make law and to govern domestically was very limited. And you had the council of the elders and the assembly in Sparta, where most of the power was actually held.
Yeah, there was a popular assembly of the Spartiate citizen population.
Right. So even in some of these cases where people might say, oh, well, the Spartans had kings, or maybe the ancient Germans had someone with the title of king, in these cases, the king would sometimes be elected by an assembly, or also could be hereditary, but be very limited constitutionally in what he could actually do. So he certainly was not an Oriental monarch or pharaoh.
Exactly. And I think also that needs to be pointed out is Arminius, the great hero who defeated the Romans, was later killed by his fellow Germans for trying to make himself king. It was really very strongly ingrained in these. The Russians as well. We think of Russia as an autocratic despotism because it has been for so long, but that's largely the legacy of the Golden Horde. Because prior to the Mongol conquest, Russia was a patchwork of republics and principalities with popular assemblies that assembled in what's called the Vetch, where they'd ring the town bell and the free men of the city would come and debate the issues and discuss the state of affairs. And the Mongols systematically destroyed those institutions because they correctly viewed them as a threat to their own control.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that during the American Revolution, there was a very strong interest in the ancient Anglo-Saxon constitution. Not that there was a written constitution that they were using, but just the form of government that existed in England before the Norman conquest. And so going all the way back to Tacitus and the Germans and to the Old Testament times, all the way up through the American Revolution, it was seen as a distinctly European or maybe a distinctly Anglo-Saxon form of government to base decisions on deliberation and consensus rather than autocracy.
Well, and even if we go back all the way to even quasi-mythical times like the Iliad under the Mycenaean Greeks, when you did have actual kings, it must be clearly delineated that the kings of ancient Mycenae were not anyway equivalent to the Pharaoh or the Babylonian kings who were autocratic and tyrannical. Because if we read in the Iliad, Agamemnon did not command the Greeks to fight. He persuaded them. If Pharaoh wanted to go to war, Pharaoh would say, go to war, and if you don't go to war, you're going to get imprisoned. Agamemnon couldn't do that. He had to persuade and reason with his fellow kings. And in fact, he ultimately slaughtered his own daughter as a kind of sacrifice in order to persuade the other kings that, hey, look, you know what? I will take a loss on this campaign right now, my own daughter. And, well, we would, of course, reject that as pagan superstition and corruption. It does demonstrate that Agamemnon could not just dictate orders to his fellow kings and to his fellow subjects. He had to reason with them, persuade them to go to war with Troy.
Well, that's right, and that independence of the Greeks was often cited as the source of their great strength. They would certainly fight amongst themselves from time to time, but their military abilities were based on in Athens, the hoplite, the free citizen militiaman, basically, someone who's independent enough to be able to afford his own arms and armor. And that sort of independent, but at the same time, community-based form of combat was able to overcome the Persians, and then later the Roman style of combat was able to overcome the Celtic and Germanic, where there was more focus on individual glory and attainment. So there was a sort of a balance in those communities where there was independence, but also a great deal of solidarity, and that combination led to their great success.
I guess you could argue from the Greek and Roman perspectives, the Celtic and Germanic tribes bordered on anarchy. They were so free. And the Persians were tyrannical because they had so little freedom. Another interesting component...
I think Aristotle makes that exact argument.
Probably. Another interesting component is that the city-state of Carthage was also a republic. And Aristotle argued that it had the best constitution of any republic of his own day.
Yeah, there was not much respect amongst the ancient theorists, I don't think, for the pure autocracy.
No, and in fact, in the ancient Mediterranean basin, if you look at the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, Greece, and North Africa, the republic was the normative form of government, whether it was Carthage or Rome or the Greek city-states. I mean, yes, of course, the Persian Empire and Egypt were exceptions, but generally most of the Mediterranean basin and even up into Europe embraced essentially quote-unquote republican principles. I think it is important real quick to define what a republic is. Classically, in the ancient world, Aristotle divided governments into three kinds. There was the rule of the one, of which the virtuous form was the monarchy and the vicious form was the tyranny. There was the rule of the few, of which the virtuous form was an aristocracy and the vicious form was an oligarchy. And the rule of the many, in which the virtuous form was polity and the vicious form was democracy. Now, a republic, as according to Cicero, is a mixed government which combines elements of all three. The example is the fasces, the Roman bundle of sticks, whereby the strengths of all three of these forms of government are bonded together, with the weaknesses being mitigated. And that is what the classical world, and even I think the founding fathers, would have considered as a republic. Because after all, the president was the monarchical element, the Supreme Court was the judicial element, and the Congress was the legislative element.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I was going to say another way that the founding fathers talked about the Constitution was the president was the monarchical feature in the Constitution. But then remember that originally senators were selected by state governments, and the House of Representatives, those representatives were elected directly by the people. So in the House of Representatives, you had the most democratic feature of the Constitution. Then in the Senate, you had basically an aristocratic aspect, and then with the president, you had the monarchical aspect. So it's important also to point out that that's quite different from the European parliamentary style of government. Our president is not selected by parliamentary representatives. He's selected directly by the people, but then once he's in power, it's very hard to remove him. And he is, in some senses, I won't say above the law, because he certainly isn't, but there's some ways where he is, in that he has the ability to pardon people and so forth who have broken the law otherwise. So you have all three of those features within the U.S. Constitution. So it's wrong when liberals and phony conservatives and others say that, oh, we're a democracy and we need to, for example, get rid of the Electoral College, get rid of this imbalance in the Senate, where a state with 500,000 people gets 2 senators and a state with 10 million people gets 2 senators. But all of those people don't really understand what the point of the U.S. Constitution was in the first place. And unfortunately, some people on the alt-right kind of buy into that and say, oh, well, the founding fathers wanted a democracy that would be a leveling system where everyone would be ground down to the lowest common denominator. And that's certainly not what republicanism is. And
No. In fact, Thomas Jefferson believed that in a republic, what you would have is a rise of the natural aristocracy, people that are naturally best suited to be leaders and philosophers and thinkers, political and intellectual and cultural leaders, would rise to the top through the system of the republic, which would have, and as he imagined it, built-in systems to select for the best elements in the ruling class of America.
That's right. Jefferson wasn't.
Okay.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say, Jefferson was not opposed to aristocracy. He was just opposed to the old world ancien regime method of determining who was a aristocrat by law. Yeah. That is, he wanted a system where the best people would be in positions of power, and he did not think that hereditary rights, that was the best way to achieve that.
I think the beginning of democratic America was Andrew Jackson, when he gave all free white men the right to vote, regardless of property qualifications.
To an extent, that's true. That's another interesting point that might be a whole other discussion, which is populism. The relationship between populism, the Constitution, and nationalism, because a lot of the people on the alt-right today who are celebrating Jackson as being, Trump being a second Andrew Jackson, would presumably be very anti-democratic, but populism and democracy tend to go hand in hand.
Yeah, there is a kind of weird disconnect going on there. But one of the things that we see, which kind of bizarre with they're sort of traditionalist Catholics and traditionalist Orthodox. Monarchs and emperors are seen as the guarantors of orthodoxy. And of course, that's completely ludicrous, because if we read the Bible, the kings of Israel and Judah were more often not the supporters of idolatry. And as we discussed in our History of the Church lecture series, the Byzantine Empire embraced idolatry. So, in fact, the Old Testament paradigm of kings being agents of heresy and apostasy is proven yet again.
Yeah, I think there's a few areas in history where we can look and show that the alt-right monarchist arguments don't really make any sense. And I think one of the main areas to look at is what is the current culture in the United States today, and what is the current culture in European countries where they still have monarchs. I mean, are any of these Western European countries where they still have both a monarch and a state church, are they actually doing any better than the United States? And I would say they definitely are not. And in many cases, they're doing much worse culturally than the United States is. And we've listened for a long time to people on the alt-right say that, America is so far behind. Europe is where it's at when it comes to nationalism, and they're going to lead a nationalistic revival, and we'll be left behind. But if you look at Trump's election, I think nationalism is more successful in the U.S. than in most Western European countries.
Yeah. Another point to bring out is that amongst the non-religious, or I should say, in essence, non-religious, the pagan elements of the alt-right and the non-religious elements of the alt-right, there's a kind of, like you said, love of National Socialism, a kind of, Francis Parker Yockey wrote Imperium, and they kind of envision a European imperium. You'll see videos of alt-right people about, Imperium, and they'll call it the Fourth Reich or whatever. And again, the funny thing is the alt-right likes to speak of a kind of European spirit, as if this kind of Jungian collective consciousness of Europeanism. Even if there were such a thing, of course, as we demonstrated, it wouldn't be imperium. It would be, as you said, what was the term you used? Consensual government or deliberative government?
Deliberative government, yeah. I mean, well, it's an interesting term. I mean, you can have, I suppose, an imperium without an imperator. Imperium can just mean, like an empire or a Reich, just as a term to describe a muscular, nationalistic state. It doesn't necessarily have to have a hereditary monarch in place, but maybe we can talk about sort of some of the differences there. Was Hitler really a monarch in the traditional sense, or is there a real strong difference between traditional monarchy, feudalism, and modern nationalism?
Yeah, well, I would argue that the kind of imperium that they are advocating is a kind of Third Reich imperium. And of course, Adolf Hitler is a dictator in the sense that he centralized political power in his hands. And he ruled, had he won the Second World War, or had the Second World War never been fought, he presumably would have ruled till he died. And who would have taken his place is anyone's guess, because it was a hereditary monarchy. Certainly not in the sense of
it's always a tough decision because, of course, Hitler was a very unique individual, and I don't think that Germany could have achieved the power it did in the 1930s without him. But at the same time, when you focus your entire state upon a single personality, it makes it very fragile when that person eventually passes away. Had the state survived past his death, it would have made it a difficult situation. And in some ways similar to what we have today with Trump, where Trump is really evidently the only person who is able to do what he's done. You've had other sort of nationalistic or paleoconservative outsider types who tried to run for president in the Republican Party. You had Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul, who of course are very different philosophically from Trump in a number of ways, but Trump's victory was not based on a grassroots organization. It was based on his personality, his wealth, and his ability. And so I think it would be a real question: can that survive past him when he's term limited out?
Well, the danger with this kind of cult of personality, it's dubious whether the Nazi Party could have even survived after Hitler died. He was so instrumental and central to the party. Much like Alexander's empire, it was very strong and powerful under his united rule. But when he died, succession was dubious, it wasn't clear, and it fell into civil war after his death. And I think it's in many right-wing dictatorships of the present day, like Franco's Spain, Pinochet's Chile, Selegar's Portugal, Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan, Syngman Rhee's South Korea, the centralized dictatorship seldom lives beyond the death of the autocrat.
I guess the Caesars would be the big exception to that.
I mean in modern times, but yes.
Yeah, that's true. Well,
because they're not hereditary. If it's a hereditary monarchy, then I think, yes, it can last for a very long time.
Well, a genuine monarchy has to have a religious component as well. I mean, in the Old Testament, the kings were made anointed by prophets or priests, and that continued up through medieval history into the early modern era, that European monarchs would not be appointed by the church, but were certainly consecrated by the church and legitimized by the church. So you have to have a higher authority coronate a king or enthrone him officially, and that's always been by a religious figure to give the appearance of God's approval of the king. So when you don't have that religious foundation of society, it's going to be much more difficult to ensure a smooth transition, or to ensure the survival of the political system. And of course, in Rome, the Caesar played a religious function that did pass from one individual to another. But in a modern secular state where there isn't that religious foundation, and there's just the cult of personality, or just a singular exceptional personality of an individual, once that individual is gone, there's no foundation left to ensure that form of government.
Yes. Now, you wrote on your blog, I think it might have been earlier this year, or maybe it was last year, in the context of rebutting Matthew Heimbach, about how the kings of Europe did not protect them from usury and the depredations of liberalism. Maybe you'd want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So one of the main arguments you hear in favor of monarchy, or I should say two of them, are that first of all, kings are somehow resistant to financial corruption. And so the idea here is that the problem with modern Republican government is that it allows the money power to have too much influence over politics and society. But in a monarchy, that's not a problem, because the kings are somehow resistant to this. And that's just not true historically. Kings very frequently went into debt to finance wars, or even to finance their own frivolous pleasures. And even the Russian Tsar had loan agents that he'd send out to foreign countries to try to secure loans. And frequently the kings would prostitute their highest honors, medals and knighthoods and lordships and so forth, and bestowed these honors on bankers. He even had them bestowed on Jewish bankers. These supposedly Christian monarchs, who were the great defenders of the faith, would raise Jewish bankers to the nobility. And this was often done against the interests of their own people. So they would use these bankers, frequently Jewish bankers, who didn't have communal ties with the folk, the main bulk of the population, the Christian peasantry. So the king would kind of side with these bankers, as I mentioned, frequently Jews or foreigners of some sort, who didn't have ties with the people, and use those bankers against the people. And the second claim that you frequently hear is that kings just have a natural affinity for their people, or a deep, genuine care for their people in a way that leaders in the Republican forms of government do not. And once again, I don't see any evidence for this. Interestingly, Hitler criticizes this view of that people should be patriotic to the monarch or to the dynastic house, because the interests of the dynastic house frequently come into conflict with the interests of the common people.
Yeah, exactly. Another sort of corollary to that is that in medieval Europe, the sort of feudal monarchical system, which is often idolized by traditional Catholics, was racked with peasant rebellions. In the 1320s, you had the Peasants' Revolt in Flanders. You had the famous revolt and the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. And you had over many different parts of Europe various peasant revolts against culminating obviously in the German Peasants' War during the Reformation, where we see that the repression of the monarchy and the church and the feudal system led to these violent outbursts by quasi-millenarian, quasi-Marxist people from time to time. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case for the English Peasant Revolt, but we certainly had millenarian, quasi-Marxist tendencies in the German Peasants' Revolt. But again, all of this was the sort of cumulative result of the tyrannical repression of the Roman Catholic Church and the princes of Europe at the time.
Yeah, and it was just very tragic that they couldn't come to a more mixed form of government, because if we look, for example, at the French Revolution, I guess we can look at the English and French revolutions a little bit. I do support a Republican form of government, and I think the French kings leading up to the French Revolution were definitely at fault, but at the same time, I would not side with the French revolutionaries, because they were basically proto-Bolsheviks, and they made the situation much worse than it even had been under the king. And so that's why this Republican idea of a mixed form of government, where the biblical idea that God's law is binding on everyone, and the people can't just come together as a mass and make their own law, which is sort of the extreme of democracy, that whatever the mob says is the truth. And if you don't have that Protestant biblical Republican view, you vacillate between these two extremes of very ugly communist-like mob rule and very autocratic, oppressive monarchies.
Which is funny. It's exactly what Aristotle pointed out in his The Politics. That's why he argued for a robust middle class to mediate between the rich and powerful at the top and the poor at the bottom. The poor at the bottom tend to be revolutionary and dangerous, and those at the top tend to be disconnected from the people and tyrannical. And within the context of medieval Europe was very decentralized compared to the previous Roman Empire and our current nation states today. But what has to be remembered was this was purely accidental. The conquest of the Roman Empire by the Germanic tribes, themselves tribal democracies, led to a period of fission where the great centralized powers just broke apart. And it should be noted the Catholic Church tried earnestly to restore the Roman Empire with the likes of Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. And the fact that they failed is a testimony to actually how divided Europe was. Contrary to some traditionalist Catholics, of the more libertarian variety, of which there are some, medieval Europe was not decentralized because the Catholic Church valued political freedom in the way that a Protestant or a Jew might. An Old Testament Jew. They did it. It was divided because it was conquered by tribal democratic groups called the Germanic tribes, and you had to basically start building the empire from square one, and it never really got built back. And the Reformation was ultimately, I think, the German people's rejection. I mean, you can interpret it in many ways. Of course, there's the religious interpretation of the Reformation, but I think in a political sense, the Reformation represented the sort of innate German desire for freedom from autocratic, arbitrary rule against the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope.
Yeah, I mean, the feudal system certainly is not the same as what we do today as a free society, but it was very different from the old world, or I shouldn't say old world, the Eastern Oriental monarchies, or the Roman system, where you had these very decentralized power and very complex, basically social contracts between different classes, different rights and obligations. But the important thing is that there were rights, not just obligations, as there were under the very extreme forms of monarchy in the East.
Oh, yeah, I mean, to be sure, medieval Europe was a far better place to live than, say, the Islamic Caliphate, or like Imperial China or the Hindu Guptas. But, I mean, still, it wasn't, they still wanted to restore that empire. They just failed due to the radical fission of the Roman Empire under the stress of barbarian invasion. And the Protestants, of course, self-consciously, I mean, even the Lutherans, who have a much less clear Republican tradition than the Calvinists and the Baptists and other groups. The Arminians, Calvinists, and Baptists tend to be more Republican. The Lutherans tended to be more monarchical, like in Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, and Prussia. But even in those places, the kings were not imperators. They had limits on them by the parliament, by the popular assemblies. And the closest you might have had would have been Prussia under Frederick the Great, where he was an enlightened despot. But by the time, but the parliamentary process was well underway with Bismarck. I mean, in fact, Bismarck, you could argue, had more power than the actual Kaiser due to his political influence. So, again, the Protestants have typically shied away from radically centralized power, even if they do embrace monarchy.
Right. Well, England is certainly an interesting case that we should probably discuss a little bit. I'm not sure what your take is on the English Revolution. It's actually a topic I've kind of gone back and forth on myself. But I think ultimately Cromwell's government was a failure. And in the case of the English Revolution, I think the extreme anti-monarchical attitude there actually led to more disorder than the system that existed under the English kings. So I guess one way to talk about that situation is to say that while monarchy is not the ideal form of government, it's not what the Bible says we should strive for, it's not what our history teaches us that we should strive for, it's not necessarily a totally illegitimate form of government either.
Well, there are worse things than monarchy. The pro-Bolshevik Jacobins, as you mentioned. The theocracy of a Muslim could probably be worse, right? Like a Saudi Arabia or Iran. So, right. Yeah, there are worse things than that, to be sure. But and within the more, again, the more alt-right context of the strongman, the imperator, the imperium, the Führer. Again, I don't think they really understand what they're getting at. It sounds good on paper to have a strong leader like Israel wanted in 1 Samuel. It would lead their armies and lead them to victory. But at the end of the day, that strong leader is going to take your property and throw you in prison.
Well, that brings up another interesting point, which is maybe more specific to the alt-right than to the question of monarchy in general, which is how are all of these schemes supposed to be implemented, which is a topic that's not really addressed very thoroughly. I know when I wrote in response to Heimbach's speech, in that speech he said, well, what do we do now? Well, I don't like the Queen of England, so I'm not going to follow her, which seems to kind of go against the whole idea of monarchy. I mean, if you don't like someone, you're not going to follow them. That's the whole point, is that you can't do that.
That's democratic.
You live in a monarchical system, right? Well, that's what's funny, is I think if you press these people, ultimately they all agree with the Declaration of Independence. They all agree that in the course of human events, there comes a point where a government is a threat to life and liberty such that it should be resisted. So if you push people, they all believe that, even if they don't want to admit it. But in terms of how we're actually going to implement either a monarchy or a fascist state, there's really not a whole lot of details on how that's supposed to work. How are the 25 points of National Socialism supposed to be implemented specifically here? If we're going to ban elections, who's going to make decisions? And a lot of those issues aren't really fleshed out. So I don't know if people just aren't really thinking about them. I think the one exception might be, I think his name's Michael Cushman at Southern Future. He's kind of outlined a method of sort of progressive disenfranchisement of the population by steadily increasing property requirements over generations and sort of organically building a system that would come to accept monarchy eventually, which is actually the only one of the plans on the alt-right that I've heard that kind of makes sense. Not that I agree with it necessarily, but
what's kind of bizarre about Cushman being a Southern nationalist, the Confederacy was a republic, and based on the principles of the American Revolution. I mean, how can you be a Southern nationalist and a monarchist?
Yeah, I know Cushman and Hunter Wallace. I've kind of interacted with them a little bit in comment sections and such, and yeah, they're Southern nationalists and monarchists. I think really what's going on there is that, I guess Hunter Wallace isn't necessarily a monarchist, but he's anti-constitution, anti-republic, but not necessarily a monarchist. But I think what's going on there is that their main goal is to get Southerners to think of themselves as Southerners and not Americans. And they've come to realize that reverence for the Constitution is the main, I guess, their focus, or I should say a linchpin holding Southerners together with other Americans. Is they identify with the Constitution as American, not as specifically Southern, and that's where their American identity comes from. So if you eliminate the Southerners' reverence for the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, then they stop thinking about themselves as Americans. So I think that's kind of their goal. But yeah, in general, I don't find their arguments very convincing because I mean, their whole thing is that staying linked to Yankee New England is what caused the downfall of the South, because the Yankees were abolitionists, and I mean that certainly is true to an extent. But I mean, the monarchical Britons were abolitionists as well, and they outlawed slavery before the United States did. So,
well, yeah, that too. One of the things that's to touch again on the biblical condemnation of monarchy and centralized power. I have an anarchist friend of mine who grew up Calvinist. He's an atheist now, but he told me that even he remembered, just from growing up as a child, whenever you'd read the Sunday school version of the Bible, like it's just one king after another doing one terrible thing after another. He's like, he's like, when I read the Bible as a kid, America just sounded bad. And and he wasn't even a particularly devout person, as he's an atheist now, but it's just self-evident that the Bible is very concerned with centralized power, because it ultimately leads to abuses. And most crucially, these leaders see themselves as gods. Lest we forget, the successor generals of Alexander the Great, they had the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Seleucids. They would call themselves Soter, which is Greek for savior. So that eventually leads to their own self-divination. And of course, is the greatest affront to God, that of taking his place.
Right. Well, I think another feature of at least American republicanism is this evangelical Protestant focus on total depravity, and the idea that, I should say, the awareness that man in his current fallen state is prone to evil in all areas of life, and that's what was demonstrated in the Bible with the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah, as you mentioned, is that men are so corrupt that they will use their any power they have to further their corrupt ends. So the best form of government, which of course won't lead to a utopia because that's impossible in the current life, the best form of government will take into account man's fallen nature and ensure checks and balances so that no one segment of society, neither the poor, the rich, or the middle class, have too much power, and that man's evil inclinations within the different classes will kind of work against each other and cancel each other out to a certain extent. So just another important biblical aspect to the American system.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, we're about out of time. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap it up?
No, I think we covered it for the most part. I guess maybe one other comment about how this is practically supposed to work today. One of the main reasons why monarchies and the feudal system fell apart in Europe, and this is something that Thomas Carlyle pointed out over and over again in his History of the French Revolution, is that the feudal system and the monarchies, to an extent, were just sort of fossils of a previous era where there were actually warrior kings and warrior dukes and knights who would go out and fight for people and lead their armies. That's why these families had privileges in the first place, is that they lived in a time where individual valor in combat was very important for the survival of the community, and that's really where their prestige came from. And you see that in 1 Samuel as well, that the Israelites wanted someone to fight their battles for them, lead them into battle. And because of technological changes, that sort of situation just doesn't really make sense anymore. Your leader should not be someone who is a great sword fighter or something like that. So it's a relic of a past age where the situation was very different. So it's not going to be the solution to our present problems.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, Clement. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.